What were we thinking? The year was 1989, and we were living in Santa Fe, New Mexico. We had three children, 9-year-old, 6-year-old, and a 2-year-old, two jobs, and a minivan. Oh, and we had just built a new home, barely a year and some before, in a solar subdivision just outside of Santa Fe. And yet, I wanted to leave the country again. It seemed so hard to raise our children with a set of values living in America. I wanted to practice public health where it meant something to real people. And I missed the exotic, the adventure, the new experiences of everyday life in a different place. In August of 1989, we landed in Guinea-Bissau, a former Portuguese colony on the west coast of Africa with fewer than 1 million people, where 1/4 of the country would go underwater at high tide. It was called the Albania of Africa, isolated and just beginning to emerge from the Soviet orbit. Bissau was one of the poorest countries on the planet. That first night, we landed after midnight in a hangar that served as the terminal. It was hot, sweaty, with only a few dim lights around. I huddled to one side with TJ melted on my shoulder and Lori pressed against my leg on one side, while David and Jesse scurried around, gathering up the bags. It was pitch black dark driving from the airport into our house, and at 2 o'clock in the morning I was boiling water so we could all brush our teeth and go to bed. Life was a challenge. The roof leaked. We didn't have electricity for 3 months. Although we had a backup generator, there was no diesel fuel in the country. There weren't enough tomatoes in the market to make spaghetti sauce, and there were no grocery stores in town. The kids started school at the Portuguese school. It was a small one house with different rooms, were different classrooms. Our 9-year-old was in the first grade with her 6-year-old sister, and our son, TJ, was in the preschool classroom. They didn't have electricity most of the time, so no fans, no air conditioning, and not lights very often. Our son's first words in Portuguese were "Não chora." Não chora, TJ, não chora, which means don't cry. What were we thinking? There was no regular garbage collection in the city. The U.S. Embassy sent a truck around to pick up our garbage, take it to the landfill. Mostly, people dumped their garbage in the intersections, making these big piles of garbage. Occasionally, a city truck would come around and a couple of guys in blue overalls would hop out with pitchforks and shovel some of the garbage away and take it to the landfill. One day, we piled the kids into the back of the car, drive around town, do some sightseeing, right? As we navigated our way around one of these 8-foot-high piles of garbage at the corner, the kids all pressed up against the window, looking out to see the pigs eating the garbage around these mounds. They were rooting around, feeding on the garbage. It was entertaining. It was fascinating. Those were big pigs. Jesse, sat back from the window, and then she leaned forward, looked over her shoulder, looked up at her dad and at me, and said, "In Santa Fe, we didn't have so much. We were like everybody else. But here, but here, we're rich, aren't we?" Yeah, we are. We lived in Guinea-Bissau for 2 years. I would never say life got easy. We all learned Portuguese to one extent or another. We planted a garden so we could eat, and we learned how to get what we needed. We made friends. We learned how to improvise in some of the most creative ways you can imagine. A grocery store opened during our second year, and Guinea-Bissau TV began broadcasting 4 hours a day. We all gather around to tune into Sesame Street from Portugal. I got my adventure and new experiences, all right. We all learned a lot about ourselves, what we were capable of, and we learned a lot about others, and we learned compassion, empathy, kindness. People were so good to us because they understood that we didn't know how to live in that kind of society. And our children, they learned a lot about real people and about what it means to be rich.